Welcome back to the Astral Irma channel, everybody. I'm Jacob Angelakis, your host, and today we're going to be talking about escaping the matrix. We're going to be talking about soul traps, what happens after death, and forced reincarnation. And there are certain topics that immediately trigger fear in people the moment they come up in conversation. The room gets heavy, imaginations start running wild, and suddenly everyone feels like reality itself might be some kind of hidden prison. One of those topics is the idea of soul traps, forced reincarnation, and the possibility that after death, something or someone is waiting to capture your consciousness and send you right back here against your will. You see it everywhere across the internet now, across spiritual communities, across remote viewing circles, and across conspiracy spaces. And the story almost always sounds dramatic, mechanical, and strangely physical for something that is supposed to be metaphysical. People talk about soul trap machines in space, artificial grids, memory erasers, electromagnetic cages, and entities standing near tunnels of light like guards at some cosmic checkpoint deciding who goes where next. I understand why these stories catch on so easily, and I know that people have literally experienced these things. But I'm going to explain to you why they experience these things and also why their experiences are not universal truth. Okay, when you look around at this world, you see the manipulation, the suffering, and the amnesia, the constant struggle to stay sane. It really does feel like something about this place is engineered and tightly controlled, which it is. When the human mind senses control, it immediately tries to explain that control using the same logic it uses for physical reality, which means hardware devices, external authorities running a system somewhere behind the scenes, which also has some truth to it. The problem with that interpretation in this context is that it assumes consciousness works like matter. That's already the first mistake that leads people down a path of fear and powerlessness. Before you can even ask whether something is trapping you, you have to slow down and ask a much more fundamental question that most people skip entirely, which is, what exactly are you in the first place? Because if you misunderstand what you are, then every conclusion that follows will automatically be distorted by that misunderstanding. Most people still picture the soul as some glowing ghost shaped like a person floating around like a transparent body that can be grabbed, boxed, or pushed around by some external force. But that image is deeply misleading if you try to apply it to the nature of consciousness itself. You're not a ghost body, you're not a container, and you're not an object that exists somewhere in space waiting to be caught by something stronger than you. What you actually are is awareness itself, which is like a point of perception or attention within an infinite field than any kind of solid thing. Awareness has no weight, no edges, no surface, and no location. It can't be pinned down or surrounded by walls. Trying to trap awareness would be like trying to trap sunlight itself inside of a jar. There's nothing there that can be physically held. Once you truly understand that, the entire concept of mechanical soul cages start to look strangely childish and overly literal. Infinity cannot be imprisoned because imprisonment requires boundaries, and consciousness at its core has no boundaries. So if consciousness cannot be mechanically trapped, then any form of trapping would have to operate through a completely different mechanism that has nothing to do with force or containment. That mechanism turns out to be much simpler, much subtler, and honestly much more psychological than most people expect. It comes down to perception, belief, and frequency, which are far more powerful determinants of experience than any external technology ever could be. When people hear the word frequency, they often imagine some mystical vibrational scale. But what it really means in practical terms is simply your state of being in the ideas that you consistently hold as truth. Because your beliefs determine what you expect. Your expectations determine what you perceive. And what you perceive determines the reality you experience. This process already happens every night while you're dreaming. Yet most people never notice the parallel because they think dreams are random instead of deeply personal reflections of their inner state. In a dream, the entire environment is built from your own consciousness, and whatever you feel or assume instantly shapes what appears around you. If you feel threatened, the dream turns dark and something might chase you through endless corridors or strange landscapes. If you feel safe and joyful, the dream becomes bright and expansive and filled with people or places that comfort you. Nothing external is forcing those scenarios on you because your own mind is generating the entire experience from the inside out. The non-physical state after death behaves far more like a lucid dream than like a courtroom or a factory processing souls in some organized mechanical faction. When the body drops away, you don't suddenly become blank. You don't suddenly become a neutral observer with no personality or memory. You remain who you are, carrying the same fears, attachments, regrets, hopes, and beliefs that defined you while you were alive. Those inner patterns do not disappear just because the biological body stops functioning, because those patterns were never stored only in the brain to begin with. So when you cross over into a less dense state of reality, your thoughts and expectations begin acting less like imagination and more like architecture. In that state, thought becomes structure and emotion becomes direction, which means your inner world quite literally builds your outer experience. If someone spent their entire life believing in judgment, punishment, and karmic debt, then they will experience something that looks exactly like judgment and punishment, or they'll be told they have to come back here for karmic debt. If someone believes that higher beings have authority over them, then they will meet figures that appear to hold authority and give them instructions to reincarnate. If someone believes Earth is a prison and that they are powerless victims of some cosmic system, then they will find themselves right back here feeling trapped all over again. Because your consciousness follows your frequency and your belief systems. None of that requires a machine because the mind itself is generating the scenario based on the deepest assumptions about reality. This explains something that many people overlook when they talk about forced reincarnation, which is the fact that near-death experiences vary wildly from person to person. If there were an actual standardized processing center for souls, every single person would report the same tunnel, the same beings, the same steps, and the same outcome. Instead, reports are incredibly diverse, sometimes contradictory, and often tailored to an individual's culture, religion, and expectations. Some people meet Jesus, some meet their ancestors, some meet just an abstract light, and some simply drift in silence without meeting anyone at all. That diversity strongly suggests that experiences are not centralized control systems, but personalized projections of consciousness. So when people say that reincarnation is forced, what they are usually describing is not an external force, but an internal gravity. Attachments act like gravity in the non-physical, pulling you toward whatever you are still emotionally or mentally connected and attached to. If you are deeply attached to your identity as a human, to your family, your unfinished business, your guilt, or your sense of duty, then you remain tuned to the same frequency band that matches physical incarnation, and you will reincarnate. That resonance naturally pulls you back into another life that fits those unresolved patterns, much like a magnet finding metal without anyone pushing it. From the inside, that pull can feel compulsory because the person never realizes they are the one generating the attraction. It feels like something outside is forcing them, when in reality their own attachments are guiding the movement. This is why the real matrix is not some giant device orbiting the planet, but it's the network of beliefs and ideas that shape how you interpret reality. Beliefs become invisible walls and conditioning becomes invisible chains, and both are accepted as normal simply because most people never question them. The moment you believe something has authority over your soul, you hand that authority away without ever noticing you actually did. The moment you assume you're small or guilty or powerless, you create a self-image that can easily be manipulated by any narrative that promises rescue or punishment. That psychological surrender is the only true cage that consciousness can experience, because without consent, nothing has the leverage to control you. Even here on Earth, you can see the same principle at work through media, education, social systems that constantly attempt to shape what you think is possible or impossible. Control perception and you control behavior, which is far more efficient than trying to physically force millions of individuals to do something against their will. The same logic extends beyond the physical world, where influence replaces force and suggestion replaces imprisonment. So escaping the matrix does not mean flying off somewhere else or waiting for a rescue fleet or dismantling soul trap machines in the sky. Escaping the matrix means recognizing the nature of your own consciousness and reclaiming the authority you unknowingly gave away. It means understanding that you are not property, you're not livestock, you're not a resource being recycled by some external intelligence. You are a fragment of source, exploring itself through countless perspectives, and source by definition cannot be owned and cannot be contained by anything. When that realization sinks in deeply, fear begins to lose its grips, because there is nothing left to threaten you with. No contracts can bind you if you never consented to them, and no being has authority over you if you never granted that in the first place. The work then becomes internal rather than external, which is less dramatic but far more effective in practical terms. Healing trauma, releasing guilt, dissolving fear of punishment, or letting go of rigid identities all raise your state of being into something lighter and more fluid. A fluid consciousness is extremely difficult to trap because it doesn't cling to any single form long enough to be contained by it. Ironically, obsessing over soul traps and prison narratives can be another form of trapping because it keeps your attention locked on fear and reinforces the idea that you're powerless. Okay? We all know this: fear narrows awareness. A narrow awareness makes you easier to guide into experiences that match that fear. Okay? So the most rebellious and powerful thing you can do is simply remember that what you are, okay? The most powerful thing you can do is remember what you are and act from that knowing every single day, okay? Not in an arrogant way, but in a calm, grounded, sovereign way that does not seek permission from anything outside itself. When you live like that, even death loses its intimidation factor because you understand it as a transition of focus rather than a judgment day. You step out of one experience and into another with the same awareness you've always had, carrying only what you still choose to hold on to. And if you choose to release everything, then nothing can pull you anywhere you don't genuinely want to go. At that point, reincarnation becomes an option rather than a sentence, and experience becomes exploration rather than imprisonment. The door was never locked, the walls were never solid, and the only thing that ever kept you inside was the belief that you could not leave. Once that belief dissolves, the entire structure collapses quietly like a fog disappearing under the sunlight. So, there were never guards, never cages, and never machines waiting for you at the end of the road. There was only consciousness playing a very convincing game of limitation, forgetting its own vastness for the sake of experience. And the moment you remember, even partially, the game loses its power to scare you and starts to look more like an adventure you voluntarily entered. Okay? From that perspective, nothing can trap you. Nothing can force you and nothing can own you because you were always the one choosing the path all along. Thank you so much for joining me on part 3 of Escaping the Matrix. I hope you got something out of this. Have a great day.